Welcome to 6 African Trade Talks, the show that brings you closer to the intra-Africa trade business world. I'm your host, Chad Chawanda. In this episode, our guest is Harley Morlet, Chief Marketing Officer at Storm Guidance. Harley, welcome to 6 African Trade Talks. How are you?
I'm very good, thanks. Thank you for having me on.
It's a pleasure. Before we start, we'd like to hear a word from our sponsors.
Advocado Africa is a pan-African digital marketing social enterprise. With the exponential growth in smartphone users in Africa, you have to take your marketing digital. Advocado can do that for you. Advocado, minding your business.
Harley, please tell us more about your professional journey.
So I studied computer science, and I used that degree to bootstrap several startups and businesses with a group of pretty remarkable people. And most of those people I actually still work with today. So my main partners in most of these businesses is a guy called Charlie Brody and Jonathan Baker. And throughout our careers, we actually launched several businesses together. Our most recent business was a cashback platform designed for banks. It used the open banking APIs that were mandated as sort of a piece of regulation in the UK. The act was called PSD2. They made the banks open up transaction data to third parties with the customer's consent. And we seized that opportunity to build a cashback platform. And the way it worked is we signed up retailers. They would provide us with an incentive or an offer that we could then pass on to customers. And when the customers shopped there, we could see the transaction data and redeem the offer instantly. And then we would debit the retailer and send the cash back straight to the user. That's our most recent project. And for that project, we raised £500,000 throughout the entire project. While we were in charge of it, we signed up, I believe, around 80,000 users, integrated with 3 banks, and ultimately sold the business last year to our initial investors. And then after we sold that business, myself and our co-founders were looking for sort of a new adventure with technical people. We were interested in cybersecurity. And we, we're very close to the founder of Storm Guidance, Neil Hairbrand, who's quite a remarkable founder in himself. And we were inspired to sort of join into this industry. And the cyber industry itself is quite a remarkable one, and we'll go into it soon. And it's actually booming, and I don't really mean that in a good way. But the problems that this situation has caused leads to a lot of interesting, creative problem solving. So it's really inspired to get into cybersecurity.
Interesting. You've been in the tech space, and it definitely led you into cybersecurity. Thank you very much for sharing. What is Storm Guidance, and what does it do?
So Storm Guidance was founded by Neil Hairbrand. We call him the Cyber Jedi. He's, in my opinion, probably one of the most knowledgeable people in the cybersecurity space. He's got more than 30 years in cyber, and he originally founded actually one of the first digital forensics companies in the UK that worked closely with the Metropolitan Police. He's also actually, as if that wasn't enough, he's actually also the author of the book Information and Security Management Methodology, which is the British Standard Institute book on information security management. So he's a very remarkable guy. And after he left or sold his forensic business, exited himself, he saw, the next most interesting space that he wanted to work in was in risk assessment, cyber risk assessment, and incident response. So he founded Storm Guidance along, sort of 3 principles or 3 verticals. We call it the assess, plan, and respond verticals. So we focus or kind of compartmentalize our risk assessments and incident response into one of those 3 verticals. And under the assess vertical, we have a number of very powerful and effective tools for identifying vulnerabilities and risks within organizations. One of them is called Cyber 3, which is a 90-minute one-to-one interview with a cybersecurity expert, and it really deep dives into your organization's cyber maturity. And then we've got a more high-level assessment called Cyber 7, which is a jargonless self-assessment, and generates a report as well for board and senior executives to identify their company's culture around cybersecurity. And then we've got Cyber Profiler, which provides businesses with the attacker's eye view. That's an automated scan tool. And those 3 services are under our assess vertical. Under plan, we help with policy and process, reviewing and writing, disaster recovery plans, advice, tabletop incident response, practice, and workshops, essentially in addition to a complete virtual chief information security officer service. And then finally, under the respond vertical, which is our core business model, it deals with incident response. And we do that under 2 labels. One is Resecure, which we help primarily insured businesses with incident response. And we've got some very well-equipped team to deal with almost any type of cyber incident response. including expert ransom negotiators. In fact, the guy we have on team, Nick Shah, I believe he wrote the handbook for kidnap and ransom for the UN. Got a crack team of digital investigators and forensic case leads, and we provide even niche service. We're actually quite practical, and one thing that we're actually a service rolling out is a therapy service for victims of cybercrime. And we also have under the Respond vertical, we also have a service called Cybercare, which is an amazing service for SMEs, for businesses that have 1 to 20 employees, and that's our incident response compounded down to be the most effective response for businesses of that size. And we help SMEs recover and get back to business as usual with the most direct and fastest route possible. So we do quite a lot, but in summary, it's risk assessment and incident response along the assess, plan, and respond verticals.
Interesting. You spoke about cybersecurity for SMEs. What are some of the biggest cybersecurity threats right now, and including for those for SMEs as well?
Yeah, so I think the biggest threat really is a general misunderstanding of cybercrime. So when I think about cybercrime and I think about what could have the biggest impact to people addressing these threats, it's to take a step back and really think about how it's gotten so bad and what is the benefit of these criminals and how well organized are they? To start off unpacking this, and there's quite a lot to unpack here, so bear with me and please ask me any questions as I go through. But cybercrime, first and foremost, is a crime that pays. The average successful ransom is above $100,000 US. However, this average is brought up by exceptionally high ransoms, things like the CNA Hardy ransom earlier this year, $40 million, which was paid, or something that was a little more publicized, the Colonial Pipeline incident, $5 million ransom. This brings that average up. I believe the median ransom paid is around up $10,000 US. The interesting thing about these ransom, the deployment of ransomware and when you're kind of communicating with the attackers, is that they do a lot of due diligence and they really figure out that exact sweet spot number that a business will strongly consider paying just to make this problem go away. And generally they'll do some research to identify the business's annual revenue and maybe target for around 10% of that annual revenue. So when you're thinking about paying, you can think about rebuilding your data, or you can, strongly consider just handing the money over to these criminals. And then when it talks, why not only is that an incentive for criminals to get involved in this type of crime, but also it's a very easy crime to get away with. Encryption and covering your tracks, using tools that cover your tracks online are very easily accessible. And if you know what you're doing, you can really, be very, very anonymous online. And, honestly, even if you do mess up your operational security, the chances of being brought to justice it's very low. Cybercrime is a cross-jurisdictional problem that requires international coordination to bring these attackers to justice. And the statistic that I have is 0.3% of all reported cybercrimes, and this is the reported cybercrimes, end up being prosecuted and enforced. And that translates to 3 out of 1,000 malicious reported cyber incidents prosecuted. So, it's a crime that pays. It's, got a very low risk for the criminals. And because of this, last year it was estimated that cybercrime costs the global economy at the moment $1 trillion a year. So, there's that. And also people should understand, has it gotten so bad and how is it, what are some compounding factors to this? Well, firstly, COVID, people working remotely, attackers have a much larger digital estate that they can attack. They can consider attacking individuals and home networks, and it's a bit of a, to some degree, a security nightmare. And some people attribute that to why we've with an increase, especially since COVID, an increase in cyber incidents, especially since COVID struck. But in my personal opinion, I think, all the ingredients were already there for this perfect storm. And one of the strongest ingredients really is the introduction of cryptocurrencies. These criminals using cryptocurrencies can very easily extort businesses and cover their financial tracks in a very straightforward manner. And, I know there's a lot to unpack here, but just one additional point that I want to add is when people think about cybercrime, one of the biggest misconceptions is that, when people think of hackers, they think of, maybe a super intelligent kid, breaking into the FBI from their mom's basement. But really, these criminals are businessmen, and they work 9 to 5 in offices, primarily in countries outside of your country's jurisdiction. And, either they're working in these sort of call center type offices, or maybe they have come over from more traditional organized crimes. They've moved from guns and drugs to cybercrime because it is, as I said, a crime that pays. So they're moving their infrastructure over to start doing these sorts of crimes. And the structure or the ecosystem of the vertical, the cybercrime vertical, I should say, is that these attackers, the people who perpetrate the crimes, they're being supported by a lot of criminal services. So, the attackers might not be the ones that identified the vulnerabilities in the business. In fact, there's an entire business service of initial access brokers who will break into organizations, identify the vulnerabilities, and package them and sell them to attackers so that they can then attack at scale, i.e. the initial access brokers maybe don't want the liability or don't want to really be attackers, but they're happy to sell, backdoors or ways into organizations to other attackers. And then the attackers themselves regularly, or, the most common attack we see at the moment is ransomware. They will go in and deploy ransomware, but they're not writing this ransomware. Actually, the ransomware is provided to them as a service. So this is another business service, ransomware as a service. And they will deploy a program that they've taken off the shelf from a ransomware gang. And, we suspect in many of the cases where we're communicating with these attackers, we're not actually communicating with the attackers themselves. Maybe we're communicating with negotiators that come from the ransomware as a service side. And they're, we're paying, if we pay ransoms, and we very rarely do, if we pay ransoms, that's getting paid into the ransomware as a service provider, and then they're passing on the attacker's cut from there. So when people look at this ecosystem, I think that the biggest threat really is it being misunderstood and not appreciated for how serious it is. And I could go on. I mean, if you're interested, I could dive even deeper. But one last thing, when it comes to paying ransoms, the ransomware gang has identified the 10% of your business's annual revenue, and you were unprepared and you don't have offsite backup, and you decide to pay, and you decide not to report, say, the incident, and you kind of naively trust these attackers that they aren't going to package and sell your data on. You have to always remember that these attackers are businessmen, and paying the ransom and believing a promise to delete data is absolutely naive. I think that packaging, personally identifiable information that's valuable to fraudsters or initial access brokers, such as financial details, passwords, passport scans, thinking that the attackers will delete this data rather than sell it on, and you can see it being sold in dark markets, is very naive. So it's a very well-structured, well-working machine. Cybercrime really is functioning like a well-oiled machine. And then you compare that to an underfunded IT department with one or two people that are just completely overstretched, responsible for way too many services, maybe without the correct buy-in from senior management. And that to me is a huge problem.
Wow, this is interesting. I mean, I've never actually imagined how big this thing is. I've always known cybersecurity is an issue, but hearing from you, it's just crazy how it's so big. And the recovery, I mean, if you're looking at 3 out of every 1,000, that's really insane. Thank you very much for sharing. How is the awareness around cybersecurity in Africa?
I think what you just said is exactly right. You're aware of cybercrime. And I think to a degree, everyone is actually. And I think if you, just before this conversation, I did a quick Google, and I looked up top 10 business risks just to see a couple of top 10 lists. You'll see cyber featured quite highly in almost every list. And also you'll see, in many lists, I saw cyber and business interruption, which also to me kind of feels a bit like cyber listed twice, because, most of our incidents lead to business interruption. So people are aware that there's an incident, aware there's a situation, but regardless, even though they're aware of it, businesses don't feel like it will happen to them. And there's actually a reason for this. It's because when a business is hit by a cybercrime, they will do everything in their power to preserve their business reputation. In fact, business reputation is regularly listed in these top 10 lists as well. And so the businesses will do what they can to sweep it under the rug and not make it public what's happened. And this generates what we call the cyber incident black swan myth, i.e. people feeling that incidents are completely unpredictable, and who could have known it would happen to me. But to give you an analogy, if you lived in a neighborhood and every one of your neighbors were getting burgled, and instead of telling you, they just swept it under the rug, and then all of a sudden you get hit, of course you're going to be surprised. So this is actually quite another significant challenge in the business community. And I think that people need to understand a measure of how well a business is responding to an incident. And if the business prepares for an incident and announces it appropriately and says, we had all these measures in place and this is what happened, and this is what we're going to do about it, and we've notified customers that are vulnerable considering the data we've lost, etc. That the public should actually highly regard these businesses and consider them as trustworthy. I think that businesses that sort of kind of are not prepared and really caught off guard and not completely transparent, that to me that's how we need to improve this awareness. So people know it's a problem, but people need to know it's happening really regularly. In fact, actually in 2021, South Africa was ranked by Accenture as having internationally the third highest number of cybercrime victims. So, and that statistic comes to, as a shock to many people that I speak to in the region.
I can believe that. A few months ago, there was an issue that was even on the news of top organizations being hacked. And I think one of them was the company's offices. So it's interesting how, cybersecurity has grown, yet not many people pay attention to it, even though they know about it. So thank you very much for sharing. Before we continue, I would like to hear a word from our sponsors.
Did you see that billboard? No, I didn't. I was looking at my phone. That's how billboard advertising is now ineffective. If you ever wondered how to employ people with disabilities, then by working with Advocado, you would have just done that. Advocado is a social enterprise focusing on using digital marketing to create employment for people of determination and young women across Africa. Let's do it together. If you want to make a difference, contact us now at www.advocado.africa.
Harley, based on your travel experience across Africa and internationally, what cybersecurity lessons can you share?
I've actually done some extensive traveling in my life. I was brought up as an expat. I've moved around every couple of years. So I've lived in Australia, in Sydney and Perth, and all over Southeast Asia, Singapore. Spent a year in Singapore, 3 years in Korea. I went to university in the UK, and I've traveled across America and lived in America. And I'm now living in Mauritius. And I've genuinely firsthand seen, how different cultures handle situations differently. However, when it comes to cybersecurity, I think most countries treat it the same way, and they treat it as purely a technical problem. And the reality, it's not a technical problem. It's actually a problem that needs to be addressed first and foremost by the company's culture. And that means it needs to be dealt with some appropriate leadership. So, if the directors and officers and really put their heads in the game and thought about cybercrime as a company culture problem, and they, trained their staff to be aware of suspicious behavior and to be on the lookout for vulnerabilities, and, it made the employees from the highest director to the lowest employee have an appreciation for security and, understand why certain security measures are put in place. I think that this would really help with this problem in the whole. I actually have an anecdote from a business I spoke to here in Mauritius, where the IT team wanted to implement two-factor authentication. And when it comes to two-factor authentication, I mean, the cyber community, you'll see regularly people talk about how passwords are dead. And when I mean that, and just to give you a practical understanding of why passwords are dead, if you're thinking about attacking a business and you go onto their LinkedIn and you see they've got 75 employees or 50 employees, and you can take those employees' emails, their business emails, straight from LinkedIn using various tools, or maybe even also acquire their personal emails using similar tools. For each of those employees, you can then take them to an online breach database, i.e., you input an email and it tells you where that data has been seen in breaches throughout all the breaches that have been publicly posted by gangs and attacks and results of poor data protection. And you can identify those individuals, and from those databases that have been breached, there are various ways that you can kind of figure out passwords through those databases. And really, many people don't use password managers. They recycle their passwords. And so, with a list of employees and their personal emails, you can work your way through the ones that look like they're recycling their passwords, and then you can use those passwords to log into a portal. So two-factor authentication is highly recommended. Inside our organization, we won't use any service that doesn't provide a second factor of authentication because passwords are dead. And so coming back to this story, this business, the IT team suggested to the organization, they really wanted to push the organization into using two-factor authentication. It's overstretched IT team, and they convinced the senior management, they implemented it, and there was a huge amount of backlash across the entire organization. And they, in fact, ended up only implementing it for 2 days before reverting back to just passwords. And that, to me, is a demonstration of a poor company culture around cybersecurity. And so this attitude of security needs to start with the board and the senior executives. They need to not treat it as just a technical problem. They need to buy into understanding that it's not a technical problem, it's a cultural problem. Many of the solutions may be technical, but also many of the solutions are cultural. And once you have that buy-in, the technical team within the organization needs to implement the right measures. So yes, that is what I've seen.
Thank you very much for sharing. And I'm sure all our listeners will immediately go into what is it called?
Two-factor authentication. So actually, I mean, for those listening that are interested in implementing it, essentially most online services allow you to add two-factor authentication. Generally it's either used via an SMS text that's sent to your phone, so you input your phone number, but a better way to use it is to install an app called the Google Authenticator. You'll scan a QR code, and then every time you input your password, you'll have to input a code that's shown within that app. The code refreshes every few minutes. And it's a minor inconvenience at first, but once you get used to it and appreciate why it's important, you'll never look back. So I highly recommend that. In fact, generally when we suggest to businesses the things you can do, two-factor authentication is generally the first piece of advice we provide.
Thank you very much for sharing. What opportunities do you see in the cyberspace in Africa?
So really, in my opinion, it's the opportunities that Stormdown is pursuing, and that's an affordable incident response for SMEs and effective, actionable risk assessments. On the first point, the average cost of a cyber incident to an SME is $25,000, which is 400,000 South African rand. And based on what I've shared today, not only are incidents on the rise, but they're also they are more prevalent than you think. So to address this opportunity, we've built a response service specifically for businesses with 1 to 20 employees that provides the best chance to recover and the shortest route to returning to business as usual. And that service is called Cybercare. It includes a 24-hour emergency hotline with technical triage, forensic investigation, and a complete incident response. Will identify how the criminals got in and how to recover and what to do about it and how to prevent that from happening again. And when it comes to affordability, when you compare the cost of an incident, the cost of this service, it's 2,500 Rand per year. If an organization suffers an incident, they pay a one-off fee of 6,500 Rand. It really is worth considering that you should be implementing this cover, but an incident can really destroy business. And I've seen a lot of that firsthand in some of the incidents that we deal with. So that, to me, I think is one of the biggest opportunities. And the others in effective and actionable risk assessment. And this service, actually, I'll mention in regards to risk assessment, is actually included in Cybercare. But we've built a tool that's called Cyber Profile. And I think it's a very cool tool. I love talking about it. But essentially, it takes domain and it surveils an entire organization's digital estate for the common vulnerabilities that attackers are using to get inside of these businesses. And we actually call it the attacker's eye view. And the purpose is to help businesses identify very effectively how they're perceived and what are the measures they can take to make themselves look like a hard target. And criminals are opportunists. They will not spend their efforts on organizations that do not look like they'll yield results. So after we scan an organization, we compile the findings into a concise report. And if the business follows these easy to follow steps, they'll bring their head below the parapet. And if these criminals actually regularly pick a vertical to target. One example could be private schools. We saw a number of incidents with private schools where the criminals are recycling the same strategies, but with different businesses in the same vertical. And when they're scanning for these businesses or looking at these businesses, they're not going to approach a business that looks like a hard target. So this, in assessment, that is the opportunity that we also see. So when it comes to your listeners, if we want to have a large, meaningful impact, and we want to provide these services affordably, and we're doing this in partnership with associations and groups. So if your listeners are members of a group or they run a group or association and they feel like they could be doing more to protect their businesses, I encourage them definitely to get in touch. I'd love to have a conversation, or if any of your listeners want to have a cybersecurity conversation, I'll share my email with you. But generally, I think the opportunity in Africa is to provide services that are designed to have meaningful impact on prevention and recovery, and while also making them affordable.
Thank you very much for that. What opportunities do you see from a cybersecurity point as we move into a continental free trade environment?
I really like this question, and I gave it a bit of thought, actually, and I spoke to Neil Herbram, the CEO, about it. And we agreed that, a free trade continental environment will not make things worse. We think they'll make things better. I mean, obviously, the internet is already, connected and international, so it won't have a negative impact on any business that's already connected to the internet. But this agreement, I think, will allow for, if it's part of the agreement, allow for better coordination between police forces. And through that, we might actually see an improvement in cybercrime conviction rate. As I mentioned before, cybercrime is a cross-jurisdictional problem. And by having, overseeing police groups that can coordinate and work together, then we might see an improvement in these conviction rates. And, to be honest, as for the opportunities, I think that any country that understands cybercrime and how to effectively combat it will naturally be more efficient. There will be fewer incidents. There will be the businesses that are hit will be able to recover faster. And therefore, I think there is a huge competitive advantage to countries that invest in this and invest in practical methods for risk assessment and incident response. And so there is a competitive advantage. And then, finally, from an investor standpoint, as part of an investor strategy, I think they'll be looking for countries that can demonstrate a high degree of cyber maturity, and they'll be looking for businesses within those countries and ecosystems.
Certainly. Interesting to learn about cybersecurity and the opportunities, risks associated with cybersecurity. What book or podcast would you recommend?
I love this question. I try to keep my suggestions in the cyber theme. So for those interested in learning more about cybercrime, there's a fantastic book called The Cuckoo's Egg, written by an astrologer who's also a Unix wizard called Clifford Stroll. And it's about his hunt for a hacker who broke into a computer at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Initially, Stroll was assigned to looking into this accounting error. It was an accounting error for 75 cents of unpaid usage, computer usage time. And as he started to investigate, it turned out that this was a hacker who'd used their system to elevate his privileges, and he became a super user in their system. And he was actually, through their system, trying to break into military bases across America. And Stroll followed the entire case start to finish, and he just documented it so well. It's an amazing book. That's on the nonfiction side. For those that are, want something a bit more fictional, there's this phenomenal book that I'm halfway through called Neuromancer. It's actually, it's considered maybe one of the original cyberpunk novels. Actually, no, that's not true. There are older cyberpunk novels, but it's the book that heavily inspired The Matrix. So if you want something that's a bit nerdy and very cyber fictional story, I definitely recommend checking that out.
Africa is a continent full of potential, but potential means nothing if we don't take action to create value. Let us take action. Thank you for listening to this episode. Don't forget to post and share this episode on your social media platforms. It will help us reach our mission of sharing knowledge about intra-Africa trade and making it available to as many people as possible. Let us grow our continent. We can go far, fast, together. If you can please leave a review on our podcast page or on Apple Podcasts. See you next time.